the US-China trade war that Australia has, of course, been sucked into. And joining me now to discuss is Liberal MP Dave Sharma. Good morning to you, Dave. Thanks very much for joining us. So Donald Trump, as you would know, he called China a threat to the world the other day. Is it?
I don't think that's the language we'd use, Peter, but certainly this US-China trade dispute is affecting the world economy. It's affecting Australia, and we'd like to see it resolved, but it needs to be resolved, as the Prime Minister said, in a comprehensive way and in a sustainable way as well.
We're just looking at the bottom corner of your screen. You won't be able to see it at the moment, Dave, but that is Donald Trump arriving in Ohio. So we will stay with this. Do you think, Dave, that it would irritate China, Trump calling it a threat to the world, while Scott Morrison is sitting next to him?
Look, I think, we would use our own language and our own words to describe China and our relationship with China, and I think China understands that, the rest of the world understands that. Just because we're there in Washington doesn't mean we share their perspective on every issue, doesn't mean we'll use the same language in describing issues either.
It just goes to show, doesn't it, that diplomacy is quite a delicate dance.
Always is. Words matter a great deal in diplomacy.
The Prime Minister, though, there's been a bit of coverage about this in the last 24 hours or so. The Prime Minister still hasn't visited China. Is that a problem?
Look, I mean, he was only re-elected in May, not that long ago, a few months ago, and, quite understandably, I think foreign governments held off, any invitations to our heads of government until they knew the results of those elections. So I think, give it some time. He's had a pretty busy travel schedule already. He has met President Xi on the sidelines, I think, of the G20 summit it was, and he may well, I'm sure he'll encounter him later this year, either at APEC or the East Asia summit too. So look, I'm sure he'd like to visit China soon, as he expressed, but all in good time, I'd say.
Do you think anything should be read into the fact that there has been no invitation that's come from China?
Well, look, not particularly. I mean, I think the last visit was 3 years ago by Malcolm Turnbull. As I said, this Prime Minister was only re-elected in May. There's a number of countries he hasn't been invited to and hasn't visited yet. I mean, Japan, I think, amongst them as well, for instance, very important partner for Australia too. So I think, this is... We'll get there in good time, I expect.
All right. The other big international story at the moment is, of course, Iran and the problems with Iran. In your view, how much of a problem is that for the Australians who are locked up there?
Well, look, I think I'd separate these issues, and I think the government is certainly separating these issues. We've got these 3 Australians detained in Iran who, we're seeking to provide as much support and assistance as we can and look after their welfare. But I think that's quite separate to the geopolitical issues that are afoot with Iran, and certainly we would treat them separately, and I'd expect Iran would treat them separately as well.
So you don't think they're being used as political pawns?
No, look, I certainly hope not. I mean, and I would say as well that Australia's contribution to the Strait of Hormuz operation is not directed against any one particular country. It's about a value, upholding a value that we should all share, which is the freedom of commercial shipping and freedom of navigation in important maritime waterways. So we don't see that as an anti-Iran operation. We see it as an operation in support of freedom of navigation and freedom of shipping.
I mean, speaking from your experience and your knowledge in the region, what are the difficulties in dealing with Iran as opposed to dealing with the Chinese regime? I mean, I would have thought they're two pretty difficult, as I said, regimes to deal with. But is there much of a difference between the two?
Look, I mean, there is quite a difference. Obviously, Iran is focused on its own region, the Middle East, and in parts of that region it has not been playing a helpful role in terms of its support to terrorist groups and armed actors and whatnot. China, though, is a much bigger state. It's got a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and a veto, and its primary area of focus is East Asia, basically. And, I would say China is obviously a major economy, one of the largest in the world. Iran is not nearly as significant as an economic actor, more important as a strategic actor. So they are two quite different countries to manage and two quite different relationships to manage.
Well, I guess my argument was coming from, the strength from their leadership anyway. But just onto another issue is the Israeli election that has been taking place. It seems as though Benjamin Netanyahu is running out of allies. Has he run out of time?
I think he will find it hard to form a government and become Prime Minister again. It will take, in a way, these things with Israel's elections, it usually takes several weeks, up to 6 or 7 weeks after the election for coalition negotiations to happen and for a government to form. It is a very finely balanced Knesset, or Parliament, in terms of the number of seats. So I think it's difficult for him to form a government, but it's also not necessarily easy to see how others form a government there. So it could be quite a protracted series of coalition negotiations, and the government we end up with might be quite a different configuration entirely. It might be almost a sort of national unity government drawing from the left of centre and the right of centre.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what does a post-Bibi Israel look like?
Well, he's been Prime Minister for 10 years now, so a lot of people don't know and find it hard to imagine. He's now Israel's longest serving Prime Minister. I mean, it would seem that if he doesn't form the government, it will probably be Benny Gantz, who is a well-known figure in Israeli political life. He was the Chief of Staff, the equivalent of our Chief of the Defence Force for a number of years, and highly regarded in that role. He's got a lot of experience in terms of security and protecting Israel. He is quite a new politician, though. But Chiefs of Staff have been Israeli Prime Ministers before. There was Ehud Barak, there was Rabin before him. So it's not an uncommon pathway for Israeli public figures to tread. Did
you have many dealings with him?
Yeah, I knew him quite well, actually, Benny Gantz, both when he was in uniform as the Chief of the Defence Force and then subsequently when he was in business. And look, he's a very, very likeable, charismatic, intelligent, smart, capable figure who's, a true patriot of Israel, who would always loves his country deeply and would always put Israeli interests first, which is what you'd expect, of course, in a Prime Minister.